There is a story, not often told, about thoroughbred racing. It is the story of horsemen, black horsemen, who learned to handle and ride and love these beautiful champions of the turf, and who would help build and come to dominate the industry for an entire century.
The legacy of the black horseman is not just black history. It's American history. It's our story. And it should be infused in the history of all that has been in the past. And so it's so important, especially in the thoroughbred industry and what it has become.
If you're interested in thoroughbred racing, you have to be interested in black horsemen because they are an indispensable part of the history and the present of the sport.
They were brilliant people because they were able to be successful despite the odds and despite the obstacles that were in front of them and that were confronting them.
When we look at the story of black horsemen, black jockeys, black trainers that were so prolific, especially at the early years of the Kentucky Derby in the 1800s, is kind of that microcosm of what was happening at the United States of America at that time.
Held as slaves, these horsemen would form a community whose knowledge and skill earned the respect of white owners during the time of slavery. And yet even still, they suffered outrageous cruelties. Although the Civil War offered potential freedom, many of these slaves would support their masters to protect the horses, helping these beautiful animals and thoroughbred racing survive the ravages of war. In the years following the Civil War, life for black horsemen paralleled the challenging social and economic status of African Americans throughout the country. While constitutional amendments would remove legal barriers, racial discrimination was rampant. At this time, the racetrack became an arena that allowed black horsemen to compete and dominate racing. In the inaugural Kentucky Derby, 13 of 15 jockeys were black, including the winning horse's jockey and trainer. But by the turn of the century, the continued success of black horsemen would lead white horsemen to use violence and the spread of Jim Crow laws to force them out of the industry. And although after 1921, the Kentucky Derby would not see another black jockey for almost 80 years, generations of black horsemen would continue working with thoroughbreds on the backside, taking pride in a history well earned. Today, new faces are leading young black people towards a future in the equine industry. This is the legacy of black horsemen. Throughout history, horse racing has been a human passion. In the formative years of our country, the urge to test one's horse against another was no different. Jockey clubs in many cities, including Lexington, Kentucky, would eventually grow to be the cultural center of the city and gathering place for horse owners to brag on and race their steeds. Lexington would become known as the bluegrass home of thoroughbred racing and horse capital of the world. A historical marker stands on the site of its first racetrack. The competitions that took place were straight, quarter-mile match races between two horses and an onlooking crowd. It would not be until the early 1800s that the plantation system of the South, a slave economy, would build horse racing into the national pastime as it is known today. Grandstands filled with cheering crowds watching dozens of horses as they break from the starting gate. This was an economy based on the labor of black slaves. Horses were important to this agrarian society, and the plantation owners discovered that the slave labor forced to handle farm animals could also serve as the foundation to a racing stable. And a successful racing stable would add to their fortune and their fame.
They started working with the horses to improve their breeding stock. And the men who did that were the ones who owned a large number of enslaved people. And the people that were assigned to care for these horses, to watch them, to breed them, to train them, to care for them, to race them, African Americans.